Good morning, students. Today I am going to speak on Sufism, which is Islamic mysticism. It is also referred to as Wahdat-ul-Wujud. I have divided this lecture into three parts. First, I am going to tell you about the beginnings of Sufism, what does the term Sufism mean, and I am going to trace its history, and then I am going to talk about its philosophy. In the second part, I am going to look at the different silsilas which developed in Sufism, and in the third part of the lecture, I am going to look at the impact which Sufism had on our culture and Indian society. So, these are the three aspects which I will be covering in my lecture, and here are some paintings about Sufi gatherings and people collecting together, the Sufis coming together and celebrating. Now, if we look at the origin of Sufism, it is said to have originated in a place called Basra, which is located in present day Iraq. And the Muslims who were located in this region started off this as a path to reach the divine. And the divine form who is worshipped in Sufism is the Prophet Muhammad, and all the schools of Sufism consider the Prophet as a manifestation of God. So, in that sense, Sufism also branched off from Islam. However, it is interesting to see that none of the ancient Islamic scriptures have a mention of Sufism in them. Some scholars hold the view that Sufism is the evolution of Islam in a more spiritual and mystic direction. In fact, Sufism in its early stages was recited and meditated from the Quran. So, in that sense, there is a very close connection between Islam and Sufism. Now, as far as the derivation of the term Sufi, how do we understand the term Sufi? There are different opinions as to how this term originated. Some scholars say that it is derived from the Arabic word Safa. The Arabic word Safa means purity, and the reason why it is Safa is because the Sufis were those who were considered to be purified of all worldly passions. They were totally away from this world and only concentrating on one God. The second explanation is that the word Sufi comes from the word Saf, and Saf means rank. The Sufi is regarded as being first in rank in virtue of his communion with the Supreme Being, that is Allah. The third explanation is given is that the word comes from Suf, and Suf is a garment which was worn by the Sufis. It was a very coarse garment, and it was woven from the wool which was totally undyed, and this was the dress of the Sufis. And therefore, these are the three explanations given about the origin of the term Sufism. One, that it comes from the word Safa, that is purity. Second, it means Saf, that is rank. And third, it means Suf, a garment which was worn by the Sufis. Now, there are scholars who say that if we read the Quran carefully, we can find both ascetical as well as mystical elements in the Quran. And many of the Sufis claim that they inherited their doctrines from the Prophet, and this cannot be dismissed because Sufi doctrines were a result of Islamic monotheistic ideas, Christian asceticism and mysticism, and as a result of the Greek and Indian philosophy also. Many of the Sufis claim that Prophet Muhammad had two types of revelation. The first one, which is known as Ilme Safina, and this is embodied in the Quran. It is meant for everyone and it is binding on all. Ilme Safina means the book of knowledge, and the custodians of this knowledge became the ulama. The second claim is that you also have in the Quran the knowledge of the heart, which is referred to as Ilme Sina, and this is something which was reserved by the Prophet for those who were very close to him, and this was personally transmitted to the Sufis, and therefore the Sufis claim that they were companions of the Prophet, that is, they were Shahabans. So you have these two kinds of knowledge which one can see embodied in the Quran. One which is obviously visible, Ilme Safina, in the book of knowledge, and the other is Ilme Sina, which is a knowledge from the heart. We have to understand it emotionally, and unless you are fine tuned to reading the Quran, you have to read between the lines, you will really not understand the Ilme Sina. So if you are a little sensitive to this, then one can look at this knowledge. Now if we look at the growth of Sufism, we find that the first phase of Sufism really starts from the beginning to about 9th century. It was in this period Sufism had still not developed as a system. It was a mere tendency, and we find that by and large many of the people who were practicing Sufism, they were ascetics, they were recluses, and they were concentrated in areas which became the headquarters of the Sufis later on. This was in Basra and Kufa. A very important aspect of this phase of Sufism was that many of the followers of Sufism were just seekers of piety, and we find that they were very much interested only in otherworldliness and understanding the divine knowledge. The Sufism of this time had still not developed into a system, and there were only two features which were very important about Sufism at this time. One was the renunciation of worldly pleasures. They kept themselves away from any kind of worldly pleasure. They did not believe in holding on to property or being attached to anything. So they kept that distance from any kind of worldly pleasure. And second feature was there was an intense fear of the judgment of Allah, and this kept them in the right path, that they had to one day face God. And so there was the first phase of Sufism, except for these two features, where most of the seekers were ascetics. They were totally devoid of having any property. They did not have any kind of organization. And second, there was this whole fear of the judgment of Allah. The second phase of Sufism really began after 9th century, and it was at this time that it developed this whole philosophy of a pantheistic mysticism. Now, pantheistic mysticism is a philosophy or a doctrine which identifies God with the universe. You do not make a distinction between the universe and God. Both of them are seen as one. And it was this philosophy which developed and became an integral part of Sufi thinking. During this period, we find that there were various groups which came into existence, and they differed from each other in terms of their organizational detail. They had different kinds of philosophical notions, and therefore, unlike the first phase, which was just a gathering of few people who were very much interested in seeking this divine knowledge, the second phase was more organized. It had developed, and it had kind of over a period of time developed a philosophy of its own. Now let's talk a little about what is the philosophy of Sufism. Now Sufism is basically a religion which is based on truth of life. It is a mystic tradition that considers a wide range of ideas and practices that emphasize on the attainment of divine love and compassion of the heart. They speak in terms of, the heart being very important, one should feel from the heart, and unless you have this emotion in the heart, you cannot really attain God. In the 14th century, a Sufi saint wrote a book which is known as Principles of Sufism, and this in a sense defined the essence of Sufism, and it says, that this is a science whose objective is the reparation of the heart and turning it away from everything else but God. So, one should be away from everything and only focus on God, which becomes very important. Now, universal Sufism has been defined by great Sufi masters as a way to travel in the presence of the divine force and fill oneself with inner beauty and compassion. The Sufi doctrine spoke about the mystical union of man's soul with God. The world was a mere reflection of the Supreme Being and one that required the aid of a spiritual guide to reach God. The whole emphasis on faith rather than action for the salvation of man. So there was a lot of emphasis which was given, and they also emphasized on God, a peer being very important. You needed a guru to reach the final stages. And the Sufi philosophy was very well developed over a period of time. Now, there are 7 stages to reach God, the 7 muqams. The first 4 stages of these are ubudiyat, ishq, zuhud and marifat. Now, ubudiyat is the first stage where a man starts realizing that he is a pure man and he starts preparing for this whole journey to reach God. The second one is ishq. Ishq is the feeling of this divine influence which leads a human being to the ishq of God, and everything else is forgotten except his love for God. A very important aspect of this stage is poverty, because unless you embrace poverty and you do not have any kind of earthly desires, you cannot really prepare yourself to reach God. And once you have ishq within your heart, we find that zuhud, or the third stage is where there is a total renunciation of worldly pleasures. The more and more you fall in love, the more you start detaching yourself from the worldly pleasures and moving more in the direction of God. Now, marifat is the whole concept of knowledge or gnosis, in which the traveler contemplates the attributes and the works of God. There is again a major difference between Sufism and the Bhakti movement here, because the Bhakti movement totally ignored knowledge and they said knowledge does not lead you anywhere. What is very important is you should have the love of God in your heart. Like Kabir says at a place, Pothi pad pad jag mua, Pandit bhaya na koi, Dhai akshar prem ka, pade so pandit hoy. So, you become a scholar not by reading all these scriptures and books, but if you have love in your heart, you become a pandit. Unlike that, the Sufi said that we cannot totally ignore knowledge. One has to first read, acquire knowledge, and only after acquiring knowledge, you will be able to decide and say that this is of no use. And therefore, marifat is that stage where the disciple acquires a lot of knowledge. He contemplates on the attributes of God, he looks into the works of God. And then as a result of a lot of logical reasoning, which is based on intellect, he abandons this knowledge and he realizes that this knowledge is not going to lead him anywhere, and he starts moving, seeking for the mercy of God. Now the last 3 stages after the first 4 stages are Wasd, Hakikat and Wasl. Now Wasd is a state which leads to a lot of ecstasy. It is a kind of mental excitement where you start contemplating on the reality of God, and this can come in, I am sure you are familiar with, you see sometimes people going in a trance. Chaitanya was known to go into trance, and if you keep repeating the name of God, you can always go into trance. So therefore, Wasd is a stage which comes where you keep repeating the name of God, you go into a trance, and it creates a kind of mental excitement. Now after this is the stage which is called Hakikat. Hakikat means reality, and when you reach this state, your heart is illumined by the true nature of God, and you see the power of God, the strength, the reliability, and you surrender to this God. And the final stage is of Wasl. Wasl is the union where the traveler finds himself face to face with God, and as a result of this Wasl, you have Fana, which is the merger of the individual with the Supreme Being, and there is no difference between the two. So these were the 7 stages through which an individual passes in order to become one with God. Now there were various practices which developed over a period of time as Sufism grew, and some of these practices continue to a large extent till today. A very important practice was dhikr. Now dhikr was, you have practices not only dhikr like hadra and qawwali. Qawwali is again made very popular today, whether it is film music or other kinds of songs, you hear a lot of qawwali. Now dhikr is something, it was a practice which many of the Sufis followed, and dhikr is something basically remembering about God. This was done by all Sufis, and basically according to Islam, one who engages in dhikr has an awareness of God, and it starts by, you can chant the name of God. It could start by reciting certain sections of the Quran, and we find that there is a lot of similarity between dhikr and the Jewish Merkava practice of meditation, which is used to attain a higher level of consciousness. The dhikr can be done through various ways, through singing, through dance, to meditative music, through swirling, and many of these practices are followed till today. And the whole purpose of this is that it leads you into a state of trance, and when you are in a trance, you can communicate with God directly. Now hadra is again, it consists of various forms of dhikr. It can be songs, it could be dance that are used to appeal to gods and angels. The word hadra is an Arabic word, and it means presence. So, you get so immersed in this feeling of God that you can feel the presence of God all around you. And qawwali is a term which all of us are familiar with, and qawwali is a form of devotional music. Even today it continues to be very popular in India, Afghanistan, Turkey, Iran, and it is known for its worldly appeal, and it transcends all bounds of limitations of countries and different regions. Some of the modern day masters of qawwali are Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan and Sabri brothers. They have acquired a lot of popularity not only in India but all over the world. And so, the form of singing which Nusrat Ali Khan or the Sabri brothers do is the form of qawwali. Here you can see some of the qawwalis being sung. And many of the films also, at least the olden days film, whenever there was a historical film, they would definitely have a lot of qawwali which was thrown in as part of the story. Now, sama is again this whole term, it's an Arabic word which means listening. And the whole sama is attained by this whole ritual of whirling dance, which is again referred to as sama. And it is basically an act of devotion that takes place a person to a higher level of consciousness. The right kind of music invokes the right kind of emotions, and which elates one to do these world dance. And therefore, it helps a lot in contemplating the divine force to a large extent. Another very important practice of Sufism was khalwa. Now, khalwa is again something which is basically referred to as the kind of retreat that a person went into. And the khalwa was something which could be practiced by a person under the guidance of a Sufi teacher. There is a very strong belief in Sufism that all prophets must have retreated into seclusion at some point or the other in order to get divine inspiration and the divine power. And therefore, the Sufi practice retreat in order to concentrate on the divinity of the Almighty. Because once you are surrounded by the world, you are involved in worldly attributes and worldly day-to-day affairs, you cannot concentrate on the Almighty. And therefore, it was very important to move away from the worldly things, retire into peace, and khalwa became a very important aspect where you could have nothing but only a single-minded focus of being devoted to God. And here are some of these monasteries where still you have the khalwa being practiced. The Dare's khalwa solitary is very important, a place where many of the Sufis go and practice khalwa. Now, another very important Sufi belief is it is very difficult to disassociate Sufism in India with Sufism and its development outside. Many a times the same saints got associated with a number of different branches of Sufism. There is a very important belief of the Sufis that the saints never die, and one can communicate with his living spirit and discuss their ideology. So, in that sense, there is no watertight compartment between the various divisions of the Sufis. And it was generally believed that a man who is able to establish contact with a large number of saints, whether they are dead or alive, is the most informed. So, you would have these Sufis who would visit from place to place. They would keep wandering from dargah to dargah, because it was believed that if you visited a particular dargah of a Sufi saint, you partook in some knowledge of that Sufi saint. And so, in that sense, there is a kind of fluidity which one can see. Most of these Sufis intermingled with each other. The devotee could move from one shrine to another. Besides this, when a saint was initiated into one order, he made it a point to go and establish contacts with spirits of others. And this he would do by visiting a large number of dargahs. And this became a very popular Sufi belief. Now, if we look at the development of Sufism in India, it is very difficult to pinpoint at a particular date and say that Sufism arrived in India at this point in time. Generally, it is believed that Sufism entered with Islam when the first Muslim saint Talim Ansari was buried in Mylapore. And it was, this was the first. And in fact, many of the Sufis came into India prior to the Arab invasion of Sindh. And after 12th century, Sufism really expanded and their activities grew in India. Now, if we look at the different orders of the Sufis, we find that the most important order was the Chishti order. Now, among all the orders that were popular in India, it is the Chishti order which is most successful and popular, because it knew how to adapt itself to the usage and customs of the country in which it had come to settle down. This was introduced into India by Khwaja Moinuddin Chishti, who came into India a little before the invasion of Muhammad Ghori. And after his death, his numerous disciples continued his mission. The Chishti Sufi saints believed in the spiritual importance of music, and they patronized a large number of professional singers of talent, irrespective of their religion and caste. Another practice which many of the Chishti Silsila Sufis practiced was Chilla. Chilla meant a spiritual exercise which was strictly observed for 40 days, when God is remembered with every breath. And they would spend their time closer to a mosque, or they would close themselves in a room with very minimum food, and the whole 40 days they would concentrate on the name of God. So Chilla was a very important belief of the Chishtis. And here you can see one of the Sufi shrines being in Delhi. And what is very important about these shrines is that though Sufism is closely associated with Islam, and it is part of Islam, but it is revered by both Hindus and Muslims. And if you go to any Sufi shrine, you will find an equal number of Hindus as well as Muslims visiting these shrines. And again, you have another very important shrine of Hazrat Inayat Khan in New Delhi. This is the Dargah, and it is equally visited by a large number of Hindus and Muslims. Another very important Dargah of the Chishti Sufis is Khwaja Sayyid Nizamuddin. This Dargah is in New Delhi, and it is also revered a lot by both Hindus and Muslims. And you have an equal number of both Hindus and Muslims visiting these dargahs. Another very important saint of the Chishti order was Nizamuddin Aulia. And Nizamuddin Aulia was known for a very liberal outlook. And we find that he inspired a large number of people in his times with his very liberal outlook and his love for God. And even today, because of his liberal outlook, his tomb in Delhi is frequently visited by both Hindus and Muslims. Besides this, you had another large number of important saints of the Chishti order who were known as Khwaja Fariuddin Ganj Shakar. He is popularly known as Baba Farid Qutub Sahib was another very important saint. Now, another very important Sufi silsila that developed in India was the Qadiri silsila or the Qadiri order. It reached India a little late, around 15th century, and it was started by Shah Niyamatullah and Makhdoom Muhammad Jilani. The other very important saints of this order were Sheikh Daud Kirmani and Abdul Mali Qadiri. What is very important about the silsila is Dara Shikoh was a great patron, of this order, and he also wrote a large number of books related to the Qadiri philosophy. A third important silsila was the Naqshbandi order. The Naqshbandi order was introduced into India by Khwaja Baqi Billah. He was 7th in the line of succession of Khwaja Bahauddin Naqshband, who was the founder of this order. A very important belief of the Naqshbandi order was that they gave a lot of emphasis on the strict observation of the Islamic law, that is the Shariat. And the disciple of Baqi Billah was Sheikh Ahmad Sarhindi. Now, he demolished this whole philosophy and the doctrine of unity of being, and in its turn he put in place the whole philosophy of modified monism. Now, Khwaja Mir Dard also tried to bring about a synthesis between the whole concept of love and legalism. He regarded himself as both a slave as well as a lover of God. So, you know, the Naqshbandi order adding on to the philosophy of Sufism and taking it one step further from where it had originated. The last order of the Sufis was the Suharwardi order. This was introduced in India by Sheikh Bahauddin Zakaria Suharwardi, and he was succeeded by his son Sheikh Sadruddin. Sheikh Sadruddin is known to be very friendly to Balban's son Muhammad Sheikh Ahmad Masood, and it is known that when Sheikh Sheikh Ahmad Masood, when he went into fits of ecstasy, he neglected a large number of Islamic practices, and then, you know, this whole order became divided into two groups, one which is known as Bashara, and they were the ones who were in favor of observing the laws of the Shariat very strictly, and the second was Beshara, those who did not observe the Shariat, and saying that Shariat is after all only a means, it is not the end, and we have to follow the Shariat only as a means to reach the end. And therefore, you know, these were the four important orders of the Sufi Silsila: the Chishti, the Qadiri, the Naqshbandi, and the Suharwardi. Now, let's take a look at the development of Sufism and its politics in Deccan, because Sufism continued to play a major role in the Deccan. Historians like K. Nizami and Sayyid Athar Abbas Rizvi have highlighted the spiritual and worldly role of the Sufis, and they tried to establish the fact that there was a very close relationship between the Sufi saints and the medieval Indian state, you know, throughout this period in the Deccan. They have pointed out that the Arab traders were visiting Deccan much before the birth of Islam. In fact, Sufism came into India primarily through the Deccan, and as I have already pointed out earlier, in Mylapore we have the first dargah of the first saint, and therefore the Arab traders had visited Deccan much more before the birth of Islam, and when the first settlement of the Muslims in south, it dates back to the period of the caliphate of Abdul Malik bin Marwa, that is around 692 to 705 ADs. When the armies of Alauddin Khilji and Muhammad bin Tughlaq came into the Deccan, they were accompanied by a large number of Sufis, and the armies of Alauddin Khilji, Malik Kafur and Muhammad bin Tughlaq went back to north, but many of these Sufis continued to stay in Deccan, and they made Deccan as their home, and they spread Sufism over here. And we find that but over a period of time, therefore many of the Sufis who had settled here had come much before the Khilji armies, but they were concentrating a lot of working for the welfare of the people in their own pious ways. Many of the Sufis were very much concerned about the welfare of society at large. But in spite of this, you know, it could not crystallize in the form of a movement. And we find that when Muhammad Tughlaq shifted to the Deccan, the whole mystic silsilas reached south, and there was settlement of small Muslim cultural groups in various towns. And it was from this period onwards that the whole Sufi movement got a new direction and it developed along new dimensions. We find that all the tradition of Muslim mysticism as they had developed in North India were now transplanted into the south. We had the Mudakirs, that is the preachers of Delhi, who were seen delivering sermons in various towns and to the various kawabs, that is the musicians. And we could find that they were reciting the verses of Amir Khusro and Amir Hassan in courts and streets. So from this time onwards, Sufism really reaches the ground level. It becomes very popular among the masses. Now Sufism found a place in medieval Deccan society and polity through its special techniques like Sama, which I have already explained to you. It is a gathering of saints where they go into this kind of ecstasy. It also went into, became popular because of the various Urs which were celebrated, the concept of Vazd or ecstasy. And when these coincided with deliverance from disease, we find that it had a lot of impact, because many people believe that, they were relieved of a lot of painful experiences after they visited the Sufi saints. And therefore, this had a lot of impact on the Sufi movement. The whole Sufi ideology influenced people at a very popular level in the Deccan. It oriented more towards a spiritual life rather than a material life. The Sufis define man more in terms of becoming than being. You are born as a particular person, but what is important is your whole journey of becoming. And in that sense, they looked upon human life as a storehouse of misery, and one could get salvation only by renouncing worldly pleasure, and only then could one be relieved from the misery of the world. However, another very important aspect is when we talk about the Deccan, the Chishti Silsila in the Deccan, unlike the Chishti Silsila in North India, it did not live in isolation. It did not strip itself of totally social and political loyalties. In the north, the Sufis kept themselves much away from the court. They distanced themselves. But in the south, they were intermingling with politics, with state, and they were influencing both these. And we find that they use their whole mystical identity to realize more fully their political aspirations. So, they also dabbled with politics, unlike the Sufis of North India. And we find that the Sufis organize various worldly organizations like khankas and madarsas. They also adapted Turkish, Persian and Deccani ideas and impressions along with their Islamic identity. The Bahmanis who came in the Deccan also played a major role in patronizing the Sufis, and this gave a lot of fillip to the Sufi movement in the Deccan. And we find that the Bahmanis particularly patronized some of the Sufi saints like Sheikh Ahmad, Harawi, Sharif, Shamarkandi Al-Hussein. Gesu Daraj was very popular with the Bahmanis. Then you have Hakim Hassan Gilani, Hakim al-Tabrezi and many more. So, the Bahmanis openly accepted and patronized these Sufi saints. We find that many of these Sufi saints, when they visited the courts in Deccan, they were accompanied by a large number of their disciples, which included Valma, Unara and people who were skilled in various professions. We find a large number of madarsas opened up in Daulatabad, Warangal, Aurangabad, Naldurg, and you have not only khankas but madarsas, maktabs, and Sufism became very popular in the Deccan. We find that many of these centers which had opened in Deccan popularized the Persian language. And however, it was a very minuscule percentage of the population which was literate at this time and which could read and write in Persian. One of the very important aspects of the Sufis was that they tried to establish a direct contact with the common man. They tried to share in the joys and sorrows of the common man, and this led to a development of a new literature. Since the common man did not understand Persian, which was the language of the court, the Sufis developed a new kind of language which is referred to as, by the historian H.K. Sherwani, as Proto-Urdu. And in the Deccan we have a new kind of language which is known as Rekhta. Now Rekhta is a language which is Deccani Urdu, and this was the Sufis used Rekhta to communicate a lot with the common people. Yet in spite of this, Persian continued to be the official language of the state, but then by and large many of the Sufis spoke in Rekhta, they composed their songs in Rekhta, and many of the treatises which they wrote in this vernacular, they were so simple, they could be easily understood by the masses, that they could easily memorize them. And this was one reason why Sufism became very popular in the Deccan. Now, the reason why Sufism became so popular all over India, definitely much more in the south, in the Deccan as I have pointed out, than in other places, was by and large, the Sufis understood Indian society very thoroughly. They preached the whole attitude of Sulh-e-Kul. Their whole basic philosophy was Sulh-e-Kul, that is, peace with all creeds and cult. And they were talking in terms of social harmony. They did not only limit themselves to Muslims, but a large number of non-Muslims who had not accepted Islam were also welcome into their fold. They did not lay down a condition that you had to become a Muslim in order to get access to a Sufi. You could be of any religion, you could be of any caste, creed or color, but you were always welcome to a Sufi khanka if you accepted their whole values of every human being equal. And by and large the Sufis taught to abstain from sin, and they remained detached from material realities of the world. Like I have already pointed out at the beginning of my lecture, one of the basic ingredients of the Sufi philosophy was that they accepted poverty. Poverty they regarded as a major state to reach God. And since all of them believed in this, they did not want any kind of worldly possessions. They were not seeking any kind of patronage or worldly possessions. And we find that a kind of the way their ideology developed, it gave a very strong basis to medieval state. Though many of the rulers did not necessarily accept their ideas, but many of the rulers had a lot of respect for the Sufis. And we find that though the medieval state justified its punishment it inflicted on people and the repression it had in the name of spirituality, morals and other worldliness, but then this served as a social framework for appropriation of the various struggles that were going on in medieval Deccani society. The Sufis also occupied lands and populated a large number of unpopulated areas. They derived a lot of material strength from organizations and the ascetic life and extended their patrimony. We find that the Sufis obtained a large amount of surplus production which facilitated the growth of the and helped the state in its territorial expansion. Over a period of time, slowly the roles changed and we find that some of the Sufis became by themselves large estate owners, and they indulge in exploitation, but by and large majority of the Sufis kept themselves away, and they contributed a lot to the expansion of Sufism in Deccan. Now, if we talk in terms of some of the important Sufis of Deccan, Sheikh Zainuddin Dawood and Hazrat Sayyid Muhammad Gesu Daraj were two very popular Sufis in the Deccan. Sheikh Zainuddin Dawood was during the reign of Muhammad Shah I, and there is a very interesting story about him, that one day he did not attend the darbar along with the ulema, and when the Sultan wanted to know why he was not attending, he answered that the Sultan was addicted to wine and many of the vices which were forbidden by Islam. The king insisted on his presence, and he wanted a written apology from him. But when Sheikh Zainuddin Dawood refused to give this, he was banished from the court, and Sheikh Zainuddin moved away from the court. He settled near the tomb of Baharuddin, his preceptor, and he challenged anyone to come and remove him from there. When he gave out his challenge, many people came out and they were so much in awe of the saint. We find that Muhammad Shah came to his senses. He realized the powerful impact with this Sufi saint had on the people, and he himself ordered the closure of wine shops and he stopped drinking wine in the company of others. So, this was the kind of impact which some of the Sufi saints had in Deccan. Another popular name of a Sufi in Deccan was Hazrat Sayyid Muhammad Gesu Daraj. Now, Gesu Daraj settled in a khanqa near Gulbarga. We find that Firoz Shah of Deccan granted him a large number of villages, and over a period of time he became so popular that it started, it created a kind of jealousy among Firoz Shah's successor Ahmad Shah. Now, Ahmad Shah was very embarrassed and jealous of the fact that the darbars of Gesu Daraj was attended by both Hindus and Muslims, and he had no peace of mind till the capital was shifted from Gulbarga to Bidar. And we find that he tried to shift the Sufi saint. But what is very interesting now, that even today, next to the tomb of Gesu Daraj in Gulbarga, there is a Shaivite temple of Channa Vishweshwaraya, a Lingayat, who turned into a Sufi saint in the company of Gesu Daraj. So, they really practiced by bringing people together, and the very fact that Gesu Daraj shrine is next to a Shaivite temple shows that they really practice what they preached. Now, another very important aspect is what was the Sufis' attitude towards women. Now, the Sufis did not think that women were disqualified to be initiated as murids or disciples, though the process of her initiation differed from that of a man. The sheikh would recite certain hymns over a bowl of water, and he would place his index finger over it, and after that the bowl was taken to the woman and she would immerse her index finger, and this completed the whole process of initiation of a Sufi disciple. However, while following the practice of Chilla, that is the 40 days when they would keep themselves in isolation and pray, we find that a lot of restrictions were placed on women's diet, and for men it was only mentioned that their diet should be moderate, but for women it was much more seriously followed. And by and large, the Sufi saints, like the Bhakti saints in medieval India, regarded women as a means of illusion in this world and the cause to delude people from the right path. We also find that during a congregation, women were not allowed to speak, and if they saw that any ritual is being forgotten by the imam during the performance of the namaz, they could clap the knuckles on one hand with the palm on the other, and the men could chant Sultana Allah. So, there was some difference among the Sufi women murids. We had a large number of famous Sufi women in Deccan, and the most important among them was Bibi Zulaikha, Bibi Aulia, Bibi Sara, and Bibi Rasti. Now, Bibi Zulaikha was the mother of Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia, and after her death, the saint would often go to his mother's tomb and narrate to her the tales of war, and then he would get a lot of relief. Bibi Aulia is also a contemporary of Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq, and it is noted in many of the literary texts that he had a very high regards for her. Bibi Sara was the mother of Sheikh Nizamuddin Abdul Murid, and she followed Parda so strictly that no male had seen her face. And according to one legend, when it did not rain in Delhi for a long time, the inhabitants prayed for rain, but there was no respite. And so the Sheikh prayed holding his mother's hand, and it rained. Bibi Rasti was the wife of Sheikh Sadruddin Arif, and it is said that she read the whole Quran daily. She became a disciple of Sheikh Bahauddin Zakaria. The other important Sufi women saints in the Deccan were Bibi Jamal, who was the daughter of Sheikh Mohiuddin Chishti. Then you had Bibi Kasum Masuma, who was the mother of Sheikh Baba Farid, and there is a story that once she was praying and some thieves entered the place where she was praying, and the thieves turned blind. And when they pledged for mercy and they fell at her feet, and they promised her that they would refrain from these acts in future, was their eyesight restored to them. So such was the power some of the Sufi women had. Another much respected name among the Sufi women is of Bibi Fatima Sam. She was very much respected by Baba Farid, that he stated that she was a male in the garb of a female. She had great mystical powers due to her piety and courage. She is also known as an accomplished poetess. Now, if we look at the growth of Sufism, after the decline of Abbasid dynasty, we find that slowly, when the Abbasid Empire was declining in Central Asia, India came to be known as a faraway land whose inhabitants were at par with those of Rome and China. India was regarded as one of the most civilized communities outside the Islamic rule. And this was primarily because so many Sufis had built up khanqahs over here, and these became the focal points for the spread of Islam all over. So the Abbasid caliphs were familiar with the works of the Sufis during this period. And we find that not only, you had these main khanqahs, and under them various sub-centers developed, and they owed allegiance to these different orders which I have already mentioned, like Chishti, Qadari, Naqshbandi or Suharwardi, and all of them lived in an environment of peace. And we find that while at that time many of the kings would use political power to control the people, The Sufis did not have any kind of political power. They were exercising their spiritual power, and through their spiritual power they were able to, I would not use the word control, but they were able to bring the people together into their fold. And the main reason for this was the Sufis interpreted Islam in a very liberal way. And we find that the large scale conversions which took place to Islam was primarily because of the Sufis, not so much due to the acts of the king who were trying to spread Islam through sword. And we find that the relationship between the Sufis and the rulers of the Sindh was greatly enhanced by the presence of the Suhrwardis, who enjoyed a lot of favor with the Sindh rulers. We find that the Sufis in Sindh had received a stepmotherly treatment until the arrival of the Mughals in 1707, and it is from this period onwards that the Suhrwardis became very popular in Sindh, and they really could establish a very strong base. They helped a lot in refining and developing the Indian languages and bridging this whole spiritual gap between the masses and the people. So therefore, even today we have a large number of dargahs of the Sufi saints. Here is one dargah which is in Rajasthan, and which became very popular. This is another, Kapasan, another dargah of the Sufi. Now in my last section, I would like to sum up by talking about the contributions of the Sufis. And we find that a large number of Sufis, eminent Sufis, have a whole vision of Islamic spiritual life was very broad based. It gave a lot of moral courage to the people by awakening them to spiritual values and reliance to God. If you look at the medieval period, we find that it's a period where it is full of calamities such as droughts, floods, and there would always be panic because of the protracted wars. There were so many invasions. Those of us who know the history of India know that this was a period which is filled with a lot of wars, invading armies coming and looting. The condition of the peasantry was very bad, and it was in this environment that the Sufis really played a lot of, they almost had an effect of providing a balm to the people. The early Chistis believed that the contact with the saintly was the only means by which people would renounce the evil and convert to Islam. They did not believe in forceful conversion. The social and economic positions of the masses of Muslim converts who adapted Islam under various pressure was in fact no better than the Hindu masses because of the dominance of the discriminating ruling classes. And in this environment, we find that the Khanqahs offered peace and comfort to thousands of Muslims who crowded the towns. Today, we lack literary evidence, and this becomes one of the most formidable obstacle to present any picture of the village Khanqah, where the tombs of these local peers or murids was there. We really do not have much information on the village Khanqahs, and where a large number of people, whether the dargahs were of real Sufi saints or fake Sufi saints, it's very difficult to say. But we do not have literary evidence at that level, and therefore it becomes a little difficult to really assess the impact. Yet in spite of this lacuna, we can say that there was a major impact which the Sufi movement had, because the urs which were celebrated in a large number of these dargahs and of the local peers, these became occasions for the celebration, And over a period of time, the Khankas developed into very significant cultural institutions, and they played a major role in the cultural life of medieval India. Now, Albert Schweitzer says that one of the greatest spirit's task is to produce a theory of universe. And it is in this that all ideas, convictions and activities of that age have their root. Now, not only did the Sufis produce a theory of the universe, but they also built their lives in consonance to it. They spoke of the whole doctrine of Wahdatul Wujud, that is, what exists objectively as well as subjectively outside the mind of man as well as inside is one. Meaning that by whatever name we may call it, we can call it universe, we can call it nature, we can call it reality, truth or God. So, the greatest contribution of the Sufis was giving this whole idea, this whole philosophy of a theory of universe, and this was a major contribution which they made in the realm of philosophy. The Sufis also made a contribution not only in the philosophical realm but also into the day-to-day life, because by and large the Sufi mystics believed in a very pacific and non-violent approach to all problems of human society. Force, they said, created more problems than it solved. So they encouraged the development of the faculties of patience and endurance. They felt that self-criticism was the best way to minimize the chances of friction in a society. The Muslim mystics of early stages had completely cut away themselves from kings, politics and government service. These, they felt, distracted them from a single-minded pursuit of God. They also rejected offers of jagirs, endowments, and they felt that acceptance of such gifts would make them subsequently to the royal wish, and it would curb their independence, which they did not want. And many a times, many of the kings in medieval period offered a large number of gifts and jagirs and government servant to the Sufis, but many of them refused to have them. And the greatest contribution of the Sufis was that they understood Hinduism, and they brought about a much more synthesis between Islam and Hinduism. We find that when the settlement of Muslims in India took place, initially, after conciliation and concord between various cultural groups, we find that there was an urgency and an intellectual demand and a social necessity that both these groups end their period of conflict and reconcile and settle together. Now, Sufis rose to this occasion and they released synergetic forces which liquidated social, ideological and linguistic barriers between groups, and it helped in the development of a common cultural outlook. This was their major contribution, by bringing both these groups together. The Sufis, the Muslim mystics, they comprehended Hindu religion at a very psychological and emotional level rather than philosophical. They were not interested in the philosophy of Hinduism. They wanted to understand how people practiced it. They were more interested in the practice of Hindu religion rather than its philosophy, and they established very close relationship with these aspects. They spoke of unity of God, brotherhood of man, and by and large the Hindu mind was moved by this. We find that many of the Bhakti saints who came from the lower strata during 14th and 15th century, especially Kabir, Nanak, they were very much influenced by the Sufi ideas, and many of them had participated in the Khanka life. Now, medieval India brought in its wake an urban revolution, and with the establishment of the urban revolution, There was also a moral laxity and social vices were clear, and the whole environment that prevailed in Delhi after the death of Balban and Alauddin Khilji was a decline in social more. We find that the Khankas acted as a counterweight in maintaining moral equilibrium in medieval society. The Sufi saints spoke against slavery, hoarding, black marketing, profiteering and drinking of wine, etc. Barni remarks in his Tarikh-e-Feroz Shahi that as a result of the teaching of these Sufis, the vices among men have been reduced, and by and large the Sufis believed in a very pacific and non-violent approach to problems of human society. They did not really believe in any kind of force, because they felt that force creates more problem than it solves. And when the Sufis came into India, we find that much before the Oriental conquest, they had come into an Indian society which was already a caste-ridden society. By and large, with their unassuming way, human sympathies and the whole classless atmosphere in their Khankas, they attracted the depressed sections of Indian society. Their political attitude also endeared them to the public. They fought against illiteracy, and rather than the rulers, it was they who held the Islamic principle of equality and brotherhood. The whole contamination of the court life could not touch the serenity and classless atmosphere of a Khanka. With settlements of Muslim in India, conciliation and concord between the two groups became an intellectual demand, and we find that the Sufis played a major role in this. They understood Sufism in a much more emotional way. We can really understand much of the contribution of Sufis if we understand their poetry. If we read some of their poetry, they try to, in their whole philosophy of dedicating their whole being to the absolute, the Sufis attained a lot of spiritual goal through intuition, esoteric knowledge and experience of the mystical world. So naturally they were an antithesis of the solely intellectual experience which was fostered by some philosophers. Not only was the Sufi poetry an expression of mystical love, of a thirsty soul seeking an intuitive understanding of God, but it was an avenue for the outlet of emotion and spiritual feeling of otherworldliness, which could never be expressed because of the fury of orthodoxy, social inhibition and political repression, which were very common in the medieval ages. And we find that many of the Nathpanthis and Vaishnavite symbols which were used did not necessarily make them syncretic, and we find that a large number of Sufis used these symbols, and yet they enjoyed a reputation for a deep devotion to Islam. And we find that both the Sufi poets of the regional languages and the pioneers of the Hindu Bhakti movement rebelled against all forms of religious formalism, falsehood, hypocrisy and stupidity, and they tried to create a world where spiritual bliss was the all-consuming goal. Now, we find that the devotion of some of the rulers and members of the governing classes to the Sufis went a long way in making possible the erection of certain masterpieces which still stand today in architecture, such as the tomb of the Shuharwardi Sheikh Ruknuddin Multan, the Khanka of Mir Sayyid Al-Hamdani in Srinagar, and the tomb of Sheikh Muhammad Gawat in Gwalior and Sheikh Salimuddin Chishti in Fatehpur Sikri. Even the Mughal miniatures did not neglect the Sufi landscape, and some of them integrated Sufi themes in many of their paintings. And we find that Many of the Sufi belief systems and practices had a lot of parallel in Indian philosophical literature, and we find that they were also circumstanced by boundaries of what Islam could politically tolerate. And even most of the Sufis, like Hindu Vedantas, considered formal religion only as a shell. They still didn't reject formal religion, and they allowed the day-to-day average practitioner to follow day-to-day rituals and traditions which could play a useful role. So by and large, most of the Sufis were not outright rebels, but they adapted to the pressure of mainstream religion.